Hey crafters, I am so excited for today's project. Today we're going to be making a top using pretty much only granny squares. Now I'm not going to show how to make a granny square in this video. I have some other tutorials and links for that, but I am going to show you the basic construction of this and how you can size it to fit your body. Having said that, I already crocheted some of my pieces off camera and they've been sitting for a while, but I forgot what hook size I was using. So I'm pretty sure that I used my 5mm crochet hook, and hopefully that doesn't totally throw off my gauge when I show you a couple different things. But anyways, I'm going to be using some of this sugar wheel cotton. It's a weight 3 cotton. They call for a 4.5mm hook size, but I went up to a 5mm. At least I think that's what I did. But anyways, you can use any kind of yarn you want. I think this is a great option for some cotton yarn. And I went with this yarn because I think it's just fun having the variegation already worked in there and not needing to worry about changing color. So let me show you what we need to crochet. So first we're going to have 2 large panels for the front and back. Here on the table we have the front panel. This is a granny square. This is a square shape, of course, because it's a granny square. And the important thing with this is that the width of it is enough to go from the middle of one side to the middle of your other side and across the front of you. The way I word it's kind of weird, but you can see here on camera the way I'm holding it up. This piece is going to sit just underneath the armpit, and it's going to go from the middle of your left side to the middle of your right side and across the front of your body. So your first step is to make a granny square that is the right size to fit your body. Then we're going to make a back piece, and the back piece is going to also be a granny square, but you may find that you don't need as much fabric for your back square as you do for your front square. So what I'm showing here is I'm holding the back square up, lining it up at the same point I lined the front square up. So I'm lining it up from the middle of my left side to the middle of my right side, but this time I'm going across my back instead of across the front of my body. When you work this back panel, you might find that the same size square as what you used for the front works great, or like in my case, you might find you want a smaller square. My back square didn't need to be as large as my front square because I needed a little bit more fabric in the front to get across my chest, so your back square might not need to be as wide. So if we look here, this is my front square and this is my back square, and this one is just a little bit smaller. So if you decide to make your back square a little bit smaller, you'll also notice that in addition to being narrower, it's also going to be shorter. And when we go to seam the sides, the front's going to end up being longer than the back. So with that understanding of how this project comes together, let me show you how to deal with the situation if one of your squares needs to be smaller than the other, so that way they can have different widths but the same length. So in my case, I have this smaller square on top here, and I did 2 fewer rows on this granny square than I did on the large granny square. So you might be thinking, oh, we just need to add along the bottom 2 more rows. But we actually need to double it and add 4 because we have to account for 2 extra rows at the top and 2 extra rows at the bottom. Now I'm going to line up the top edges when I assemble this and add all 4 extra rows to the bottom of my smaller square. But the important thing is to add the right number of rows. So now that we know how many rows to add, let me show you how we can actually add these rows, since we're going to have to work back and forth versus in the round. So here is where I joined the last round of this granny square. What we need to do is we need to get our yarn to the corner. So if you ended up somewhere way far down, you of course can detach your yarn and then reattach in the corner. But in my case, I'm just going to slip stitch to the corner. So slip stitch in the top of that stitch, in the top of this stitch, and then slip stitch into the corner. And once I'm there, I'm going to start working along this edge. This is where we're going to add the 4 rows. So because we're not working in the round, we're not going to create a true corner, but we will need to put a few stitches into this spot to create our edge. So in this corner where we're starting off, we're going to put 2 double crochets. Now I love the alternative turning chains, so I'm going to use that for my first double crochet by inserting into the corner, yarn over, pull up a loop, and then yarn over, pull through 2, and then find the left vertical strand of what we just worked, insert my hook underneath it from right to left, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2. And that is the alternative turning chain. It takes the place of a turning chain and it counts as our first double crochet. So that's 1, and then I'm going to put a second double crochet into this corner space. Once I work those 2, I'm going to put 3 double crochet in between my 3 double crochet clusters of the previous round, and I'm going to work all the way on down to the next corner. So I'm putting 3 double crochet here, 3 double crochet in my next spot, and I'll meet you at the corner and show you how we deal with corner number 2. So as I get down to the final end, we're going to basically mirror what we did to start the row. And so to start the row, we put 2 double crochet in the corners. So in this final corner, I will also put 2 double crochet into the corner. That's 1. And this is, oops, my project's falling off the table. And this is 2. So now for the next row, I'm going to turn my work over because we're not going to keep working in the round like we normally do for granny squares. We're going to have to turn to work along just the one side. And the way I'm going to work the following row is I'm going to start with a double crochet in my first stitch. And again, I like to use that alternative turning chain. And if you want some more resources on that, I'll link to some other videos. So I'm using that alternative turning chain. It's going to get rid of my turning chain and count as my first double crochet. And then I'm going to go to my next space between stitches and work 3 double crochet in there. So 1, 2, and 3. And then I'm going to work 3 double crochet in every space along until I get down to the other end. And then once more, I'll show you how we deal with the other end. So now I'm almost to the other end of my second row. So I have this one last space here where I have my last cluster of 3 and then that initial cluster of 2. And I'm going to put 3 double crochet in between those 2 clusters. So 1, 2, and 3. And then I'm going to skip this stitch here, and in the very first stitch of the previous row, or like the leftmost stitch, I'm going to put 1 double crochet into the top of that stitch. And that's the alternative turning chain. So I'm going to come under those 2 strands right there on that stitch and work a double crochet. So now for row 3, it's going to be pretty similar to what we did the first time, but the first row we had those corners to work in, and we don't have corners here on the edge anymore, so let me show you how to work this. I'll start by turning my work, and in the very first stitch, I'm going to work a double crochet. And again, I'm using that alternative turning chain in place of a turning chain, and this also counts as my first double crochet. And then I'm going to work another double crochet, and I'm going to work it in the following stitch. So put it right there in the second stitch. So that's basically like my first 2 double crochet. That's going to create the straight edge. And once I've done that, now I can start working between clusters. So with this cluster right here, I'm going to put 3 double crochet in between those clusters. That's 1, 2, and 3. 3 double crochets in my next cluster, and then I'll show you how we deal with the end of this row. So I'm nearing the end of row 3. Let me show you how to finish it off. So what we have going on is we have 1 double crochet, a cluster of 3, and a cluster of 3. Between these 2 clusters of 3, I'm going to work 3 double crochet. So I'll go 1, 2, and 3. And I'm working that between those clusters. Now to finish it off, I need to work 2 stitches, so 2 double crochet, but I'm going to work 1 in each of the last 2 stitches. So my second to last stitch is right here, and I'm going to work a double crochet in the top of that. And then this is my very final stitch, and again work a double crochet right in the top of that stitch as well. So the good news is rows 2 and 3, those are just going to keep repeating, alternating back and forth until we've added as many rows as we need to. Now I needed to add 4 rows to the end of my granny square, so I've only got 1 more row to go, and because I just worked row 3, I will work with the process that I did for row 2, and if you had to keep adding more, you would do 2, then 3, then 2, then 3, and just keep alternating until you've added the number of rows that you need for your project. So let me add row 4 and fasten off, and then we'll do some assembling. So I finished adding those 4 extra rows to the bottom of my back panel. So now even though they're still not the same width, they are at least the same height now. And that's what we wanted. So up next, I am going to sew the sides together, and I'll probably leave this bottom edge undone and just kind of have a nice little split in the top there, or I may seam it all the way. I'll decide as I go. But I'm just going to seam from corner to corner or corner to however far down if I'm doing a little side split there. I'm probably going to whip stitch this, but I will link to a video that shows some different ways to join. You can pick whatever kind of join you want. I'm going to seam this side and this side, and then I'll show you the next step. Alright, so I have sewn my side seams together, and I just slip stitch through both loops, so there's kind of a seam on the inside, but I'm okay with that. And we're looking at the back panel here, which as you can see, we can see some of the front panel because the back panel is narrower than the front panel. So at this point, you can test it on for a fit. I also left the bottom unseamed a little bit just to give a nice little flare at the bottom. And the way this is gonna fit is it goes under the armpits, almost kind of like a tube top is about where it will sit. And you want the seams to be lined up in the middle of your sides. So now it's time to add the shoulder straps. And I'm going to be using some small granny squares for mine. I'll talk more about that off camera. But what I need to do is I need to figure out about how many granny squares I'm going to need for each strap, and I also need to figure out where to place them. So for placement, I'm first lining up on the front and deciding how far left or right I want it to be, and then I marked it with a piece of thread. Once I marked the first side, I counted how many blocks I went in. So on this one I went 1, 2, 3, 4 on the front. So then on the other side of the front, I also went in 1, 2, 3, 4 blocks of stitches. Now for the back side, to get it to line up, I don't want to count in the same amount because remember the front's a little bigger. So instead I want to look at how many blocks are between my two markers. So in my case I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 between there. So on the back I'm going to mark the 13 middle ones as well. Now I didn't have enough to mark, but in my case it ends up being 3 in from the side. So right here, and then also on the other end. So now let's figure out the granny squares for the shoulder straps. Basically, you're going to make some smaller granny squares, and however big you make them is going to determine the width of your shoulder strap. So I did a little granny square with 1, 2, 3, 4 rounds, and I think I'm going to use 3 for my shoulder straps. I might need to make it a little longer. So if I'm making 3 for each strap, that means I'll need a total of 6 of these granny squares, but you can of course make them thicker or narrower, and you can do more or less granny squares depending on how high or low you want the top and the back of this top to sit. So I've got to crochet 3 more granny squares and then I'll show you how I attach them. So let's talk about joining the shoulder straps. I went ahead and joined the first one, and I'll kind of give you a brief explanation of how I joined it and illustrate with the second one. So again, for me, I decided to do 3 granny squares that were 4 rounds each for my shoulder straps. It works out great. I just tested this on me. But the first thing you're going to do is make your squares and connect them together. So I have these 3 right here. I'm going to connect them in this order, and I'm just going to seam here in here. Now my squares are different colors, so when I seam, here I'll use the dark pink, here I'll use the yellow. Basically, I'm gonna match it with one of the colors on the squares. And again, I am slip stitching through both loops on the back side. As I said earlier, I'm not showing the actual seaming in this video, but I've got another video I'll link to for some different methods on seaming. So let me connect these 3, and then I'll show you how we line it up on the top. Alright, so we got these 3 connected to make the next shoulder strap, and basically where this is going to line up is it's going to line up just inside from my orange mark here. And here's something of note I want to mention before I sew mine on. So these kind of clusters of 3 double crochet, those will all line up with each other. So mine, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 clusters here, so it's going to line up with these 1, 2, 3, 4 along the bigger piece. However, we also have these corner pieces, but we don't have a chain 1 between here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect starting with this chain 1, and I'm going to connect between the clusters, and then I'll line up stitch for stitch going across. And when I get to the other side, again, I'll line up the chain 1 from this corner, just in between the double crochet clusters along the big square here. So if you look over here, I connected the corner to that in-between spot in between the clusters, and same on the other side. So let me attach this to the front, and then of course I'll attach it to the back in the same manner where I'm lining up those clusters of 3 double crochet, and then I'll show you what we got. So now the shoulder straps are connected. All that's left to do is weave in all the ends, and I'll show you how this turned out. Y'all, I think this is so cute, and I love how simple it is. So a couple thoughts as I wrap up the video on ways that you can customize this or add some extra touches. So first of all, once you're done, you of course can add some edging to it. You could add a ruffle along the bottom, add a little edging to the straps, whatever you want to do, you can add some extra touches and details like that. Another thing too is I used a variegated yarn. You of course can change colors every round. You can use a solid colored granny square, so don't forget to play around with color and have fun with that with your top as well. And lastly, don't forget that you can make this longer if you want to by adding extra rows along the bottom. You could probably even turn this into a dress. That might be a fun project. Now, something I do want to mention is with my shoulder straps, I used granny squares and ended up being where 3 was a great length for me. You may find though that you need, say, 2.5 or 3.5. So if you find yourself where there's a number of granny squares that isn't quite the right length, you can do like what we did here at the bottom of the smaller granny square and add a few extra rows to make it longer to kind of make up for a partial granny square length. And that's the way you could get the length of 3.5 granny squares or 4 1/3 granny squares. But whether you add those extra touches or create your project pretty much the way I show in the video, I think this is such a fun top and I'm excited to get to wear it this summer. If you do make this top, I'd love to see, so be sure to tag me over on Instagram. But until next time, happy crafting!